Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining, and hello, everyone in the internet, on YouTube. Thanks for chiming in. Today is our third session on Rethinking Games, and since we talked about various topics before, today we will look at the aesthetic aspects in regards to video games, and we will encounter the question asking whether video games are actually art or not. All right, so let us look at how we will walk ourselves through this. So first of all, as always, we'll have an introduction, and we will be talking about, excuse me, could we keep it a bit down? That would be great. Thank you very much. All right, we'll be asking the question what art actually is. We will be looking at various art theories, since we will have to talk first about art before we actually then look at the object of our investigation today, namely video games. Furthermore, we will be then looking precisely at video games and ask the question whether video games are art, and then look at the art of game design. Since we always perceive games as an artifact, as an artwork, we need to also talk about the practice of designing or creating games and ask ourselves whether that is an artistic practice at all. We'll then look at a case study I prepared for you today on the game Dredge. There was a game that I actually also worked on as a tester, and I'm very proud to share. So at the end, we'll basically ask if this discussion even matters and draw a conclusion. So a bit to me, I'm Benjamin. I'm an educator and researcher in game studies, design and development. I also teach at the Polish-Japanese Academy and supervise their diploma works, but also work externally with institutions such as the Kulturforum or other enterprises to help them implement certain methodologies on video games, or, well, educating people on games in their program. So if you're interested, you can find me over here. All right, why are we thinking games? We started this series here at the Austrian Cultural Forum, since a lot of what we know about video games is outdated, and we wanted to create a critical perspective on video games and inform people on what other perspectives there are actually, to challenge also views for not just players, but also from a design perspective. So today, our topic will concern whether video games are art, a discussion that keeps, well, popping up in the gaming community, but also in the games industry, and especially since video games are being taught at universities, this is a recurring discussion. So let us start with a rather broad question, namely, what is art? Give you a moment to think about it, and you do not necessarily have to answer that because this is a quite tricky one. If you, however, would like to engage in a discussion, just raise your arm and we can talk about that. But since this is a really, really broad question and mostly subjected to our own experiences, how we perceive art, with which kind of artworks we grew up, these perspectives can vary. So back to the question, what is art? I think if I would show you Da Vinci's Last Supper, many of you would categorize this as art. And again, you should ask yourself, why is it that you think that this is art? Most likely you have seen it in a museum. Most likely you have talked about it in school or at university. And your teachers and the books that you read about it claim that it is art. And if you look at it, it also looks beautiful, it looks sublime, and it seems like art. If we look at Monk's The Scream, which is less realist than the painting that we have seen before, we would still categorize it as art. But again, since it fairly looks different, the question remains, why is it that we think that it is art, besides us being taught that it is art? Are the aesthetic components of the painting itself, so the relations of space used on the canvas, the colors, is this what really constitutes our aesthetic experience? Or is it actually more or less the theories and the teachings that we receive on art that do make us believe that this is a piece of art? Especially in the 20th century, art becomes a bit more complex and challenging, like Duchamp's The Fountain. That is not a, well, I wouldn't say a stylistic, very, very detailed painting like Da Vinci's The Last Supper. It is also not an expressionist painting with a lot of pain embedded as amongst the screen. It is basically a pissoir that was put into a museum to evoke a discussion on art. Namely, the question that we're dealing more or less also today with, rather, what is art? Is something art if we put it in a museum? Is it art if we talk about it? Does art have to have certain components of beauty in it? What does make something art? What art is relies mostly, at least how we think about it, on basis of language. And with language, I mean what we are being taught at, what we hear from our teachers, our professors, our parents. It is a discourse that has been done over the last thousands of years, explaining new generations what beauty is and so on. In order to proceed, we will be looking now not at artworks, but at certain art theories I have selected, which we will be then using to look at video games. I'd like to start with good old Immanuel Kant, who wrote in the Critique of Judgment. Well, it's a really vast book, but condensed down, basically what Immanuel Kant looked at was whether is something art when something is art when beauty reveals itself. This notion itself is a bit problematic nowadays, because then the next question would be, what is beauty, right? But back then, in the 18th century and even before, it was clear that beauty is something that just looks good, something that looks sublime. It was, in these rather conservative times, pretty clear what beauty is, especially in regards to paintings that were striving towards a realist approach. Kant argued that this is also based on the spatial composition, so that beauty is actually out there and we have the capabilities of experiencing beauty. Okay, let us look at good old Hegel. Hegel had a slight different approach, obviously much influenced by Kant, but he wrote that no, art doesn't have to be necessarily beautiful, but art requires the viewer of the art piece to have a sublime experience. It needs to elevate our spirit. We need to feel lifted, and we need to be touched by the painting. It needs to make us somehow a better person. That itself, again, is a problematic notion, since one should always question whether artworks or art do necessarily have to have the purpose to educate us on something. Does art have to make us a better person, so to speak? That is a discussion we can have. However, we will be moving to the next theory, which is by Pierre Bourdieu. Some of you might know Pierre Bourdieu from the field of social sciences, where he established the so-called field theory. And this is a rather child of its time. Postmodernism might ring a bell for some of you, but for Pierre Bourdieu, something was art when artists, art critics, and museums decide that it is art. So the conditions of power and society, the social discourse for him were clearly what determines art. And if you think about an art piece like Duchamp's Fountain, it becomes more clear that art is not necessarily something that needs to be beautiful or needs to elevate your spirit. But if a lot of art critics and a lot of buzz and social discourse is happening around the artwork, eventually it will make itself into the canon of respective art pieces. Not that I'm not saying it is not art, but Bourdieu was very smart in recognizing the social aspects of art, of having a group of people claiming that it is art regardless of its aesthetic components. The last theory, and majorly based on Adorno's theory on art, is by Rosalind Krauss, who claimed that something is art when it reveals something latent about society. So Krauss was very much influenced by Lacanian psychoanalysis and argued that art will reveal something that happens in the unconscious. She was also very much, while she wrote the book, The Optical Unconscious, very influenced by the works of the Surrealists, so Salvador Dali, who had a strong, more or less, view on Freud and the unconscious, so more or less with art trying to represent and trying to display what is latent. And with latent, what is meant is what is being hidden. Okay, so we took a look at a couple of art theories. Still weren't a lot of games here, but I promise you we will be looking at games. And just to sum up, something is art when beauty reveals itself as something that Kant said. Hegel said that something is art when it elevates our spirit, with an R here. Bourdieu said something is art when artists, art critics, and museums decide that it is art. And Krauss said something is art when it reveals something latent about our society. Now I would like to give it to the audience to think about these theories and just have your own opinion on that, whether you think that one of these notions fits your understanding of art, or whether there is even a notion that you dislike or think is wrong. Yes, please.
So, from my point, the art is something what you decide is the art by yourself. So, for example, if you see that fountain, for this is that just nothing for me, so it's not the art for you.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're looking at something else and you're just feeling that it is art, so then you're excited.
Mm-hmm. So a fairly subjective affair. It is something personal, and one cannot establish like a generalized theory on art. Is that what you mean? Okay, all right. Any other opinions or aspects?
Well, for me, art is something I find symbolism in something that rises thoughts in the art about. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. But definitely a Hegelian approach, right? Something that,
Not necessary. Maybe something like a mix of the first two for me. Because it's strange when someone decides what is art for you, like in the thought approach. And I don't really understand going with the force of it. So for me, it's myth.
Okay, great. Yeah, obviously, it doesn't have to be only one of these theories. All of those are just layers of a bigger cake, so to speak. This is also something fairly cynical to wrap your head around, right? That society decides what is art, But if you look, of course, into the domains of fashion, for example, or influencers or Instagram, I think this becomes pretty much a theory that is applied, that applies over there. And just to rewrap that one is that art reveals something hidden about our society, for something ugly, an ugly truth about society, one could say. And we will look at that within the next examples, because now it will be actually time to look at a couple of games here just to remind the theories that we had, Kant, Hegel, Bourdieu, and Krauss. And we will start and we will talk a bit about these games and see whether any of these notions apply to these games. So with that, please play Pac-Man from 1980 from Namco, pretty classic. So needs a little time to boot up. Can we skip that maybe to second 20 or 30? Not that I will crash the presentation now. I think we will anyway play now. It should be fine. Do we have sound? Yep. Right. Wow. All right, I think we get the gist of it. Okay, I think that was anyway my task, but that it's anyway still playing the scene. So, has anyone played of you, Pac-Man? Yes, all right. Enough people to have a discussion here. And all right, so maybe you don't even have to necessarily refer to these theories. These are just food for thought here. But would you categorize Pac-Man as a piece of art?
Definitely, because for example, for me, artistic value this lies in the approach to the not necessarily interactivity, but to the AI of the game, because it's like as far as I know, every of these goals have its own underwrite of chasing the player. It's one of the first examples of using kind of sophisticated AI video games.
Yep. Well, this is definitely true. But does the use of technology, of state-of-the-art and innovative technology, make it necessarily art?
Well, as my understanding of the games as art pieces lies in the interaction itself, because it's what distinguishes games from novels. You are able to interact with it, and the use of this interactive technologies like third-party algorithms. What that was my guess.
Yeah, definitely. And you're already proceeding a thought that will follow us later, namely interactivity. Well, with that, we'll look at the next example. But obviously, it's not, if there is someone who says this is clearly no art, you're free to speak up here. This is not like, an indoctrination camp on video games, but we'll proceed to the next game, which might be a bit controversial to show here, but on the other hand, is part of the general video game canon. And with that, I present you Wolfenstein 3D by id Software from the early 90s, which is considered to be one of the first proper popular shooter games. I think you can play that. Fairly popular because you go around and you shoot Nazis in a castle. It wasn't proper 3D, but it's considered to be one of the first shooter games. Was also was taken out of the index in Germany since it contained swastikas and the like, and depictions of Adolf Hitler.
For that. It just do this French war the food peace.
You saw.
Off one. Coffee the bag.
All right, I think we also get the gist of that. All right, so we saw Wolfenstein 3D. And again, the question is, would you categorize this as a piece of art? And if so, why? Or why not? Yes, please.
Well, we will perceive it as art because it has either ironic reflection of the past. It gets maximum output without turning it into a problematic piece. Because if you not like this game, I think you will need to be really triggered about all this topic and not perceive game as it is just ironic satire and everything. And how everything, like, for me, the artistic value of it also how individuals are painted. Like, it's so stylistically has stylistic harmony. That's what makes it.
Yeah, especially in regards to how it depicts 3D, because this is pseudo 3D as it's called, because it just creates the illusion of 3D, even though it still uses 2D sprites and so on. However, it is also, in a way, and this is a bit something that I think fits in a bit the latent aspect, since this game clearly contains vast amounts of politics, even though it's of course in a cynical manner packaged into that. I think though that this game says a lot about thoughts about our past but also how we can deal with our past and also the absurdity of it. But I'm not going to go too deep into that discussion. If you want to have that discussion, there are really great books on the game that are also discussed from the aesthetic point of view. Okay, so let us look what we have next. With that, I present you Journey, a game from 2012. And I think we can just play the trailer. It's a platformer game, more or less an adventure game, where you explore the mighty sands of an ancient civilization and try to reach an end point. Could we maybe move the mouse out of the screen? Thanks.
From which crush.
Scissor bridge for it. Chalk.
All right. So, Journey, a piece of art. Has anyone played Journey? Show you. Is it a piece of art?
Yes, I was about that. So basically, after the Pac-Man, I was thinking about is the game's art and what is an art, etc. So it's hard to say is a Pac-Man the art was for me, but after seeing this trailer and reminding me about the experience from the game, for sure that is as there is this art for me because just have their everything, the great music, the atmosphere, great like graphics that not from the point that's so realistic. We just seen those deserts and those simple shapes, but they just giving you an experience and an atmosphere.
Yeah, I think experience is a really good keyword here, since definitely it is an aesthetic experience that we have. I also highly recommend playing that game if you have the time. However, I think just if you paid attention to the rotation of quotations at the beginning, that this is a piece of art, then they displayed which awards it won, because that game won 5 British Academy Awards of TV. I think suddenly we could see a bit the influence and the impact of the social discourse around a game, making it art, more or less, labeling it as art. It for sure is aesthetic in the way, as you said, it contains music, beautiful graphic, a nice way of engaging with the game. And for sure, it is a perfect example of allowing in an easy and accessible manner people to interact with such an environment. Okay. All right. However, with Journey and other games such as Abzu, and there are more games that go into that direction that are even in many cases called art games, more or less, I would be still always critical because of that aspect. How many people actually call it art? Okay, let's have a look at our last game from this section. Game that I spend a lot of time on when I'm riding the bus. All right, for those who don't know what Candy Crush is a puzzle game where you move tiles in forms of sweets, and if you have some, a row of sweets, then basically the game proceeds to award you with more candy that you can then crush. Has anyone doubts about the status of art of Candy Crush?
You consider the fourth criteria is that complete?
True. Which is a good approach because, since, when trying to look through these artistic or aesthetic theoretical lenses, it does not apply for sure. And another thing which I find interesting to look at why it probably does not apply in general is the context in which Candy Crush is played. Because usually you experience Candy Crush when you don't have a lot of time, but you want to pass some time because you're simply bored. And the question would be then, is that the context in which we are experiencing art and in which artworks can have even the power to unfold themselves as the aesthetic experience that they are thought of by their designers? All right. But of course, if you think that it is art, good for you. All right. So, are video games art? And for those who might have read the description of this event, might have found that quote by Roger Ebert, who's also a Pulitzer Prize winner and a famous film critic. He wrote that, to my knowledge, no one in or out of the field has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison with the great dramatists, poets, filmmakers, novelists, and composers. That a game can aspire to artistic importance as a visual experience, I accept. But for most people, video games represent a loss of those precious hours we have available to make ourselves more cultural, civilized, and empathetic. Okay, this was written, I think, in 2013. Unfortunately, Roger Ebert has passed away since then. I wouldn't discredit him on basis of this quote because he has done amazing work as a film critic. However, this is problematic, not for what he says, but for the fact that he's a film critic. Why do you think a film critic who probably plays no games might be having a hard time wrapping their heads around games as art? And it's something that you already mentioned earlier, the difference between movies and games.
The
interactivity, exactly. And this is what makes it so difficult to analyze games with the aesthetic theories that we looked in previously, and this is what makes this debate so difficult. Of course, I fooled you a bit in presenting you first these theories and making you seem the impression that this will be the rest of the evening, so to speak. But I wanted to put you through this experience of how actually thinkers and scholars had to deal with the issue of classifying video games by using theories that were not created for the interactive medium of video games. Because most of these aesthetic theories, Kant and Hegel, they didn't have video games. They had mostly paintings and sculptures that they looked at and that they referred to as art. Later art critics, when they refer to art, they also mostly refer to either film or to what you can see in a museum. And video games, even though there are now art exhibitions on video games, are of course usually found on your computer, on your console, in your home. And this is usually not where we suspect to have art. So Mark Ruth, one of the greatest video game historians, if you come across a book of him, I highly recommend reading it, was the person that actually made a strong case for, wait a minute, we have to stop talking about video games from the perspective of film studies and film critics and other aesthetic theories, but we need to regard the essential difference from video games to other pieces of art, which is their interactive form. We'll just move in here. However, before I continue, we'll just wrap it up. Let me just check. Okay, there was a slight switch by me, but that is no problem. So let us summarize briefly before we continue with the interactive aspect of it. So video games is art. We saw different theories and they allow for different perspectives. I do suggest that just because you find a theory that doesn't apply to your understanding of art, don't discredit it. Try to deal with it. Try to challenge yourself with it, and you might gain a new insight. However, these theories of art, they need to consider the medium that they're interpreting, right? So if I'm using one theory, I need to think about whether the theory was written and thought of for novels or for paintings. A video game might then not apply because interactivity is at the core of video games. So when regarding games as art, we need to consider their interactivity. So If interactivity is the essential mode of relation between us and the video game, we need to analyze how interactivity is constituted. And interactivity in video games is an art itself. It is namely called game design. With that question, of course, what is game design? And it becomes very interesting because if there has been ever a game designer before video games, then it was Wagner. Wagner was a composer of major operas, but he came up with what he called the Gesamtkunstwerk, which means like an overall art piece containing actors, containing clothes, containing music, containing various elements that are brought onto one stage to be then enjoyed and experienced by an audience. And this is more or less what game design does. So some of you who attended game lab classes might remember the Rubik's Cube, but I will be asking that question nonetheless again. Since I think the perfect analogy to game design is a Rubik's Cube. So if you think about it, what has game design to do with a Rubik's Cube? What makes it comparable?
Well, it's like a
True. Yeah, and a very popular and very effective game.
You should solve the puzzle how to like make on one side everything like for one column, like having sounds, etc., and good gameplay, just to solve this puzzle, how to create one whole great piece of this cube, like with organized.
Yes.
It's available for almost everyone.
That's definitely a good aspect as well. It is, and it is also easy accessible, easy to learn how to master though. Obviously also like a rule of thumb for good game design. But yeah, so game design is the art of interlocking multiple design elements and systems into a cohesive gameplay experience. And as you can see here, so the analogy to the Rubik's Cube is, of course, that you have this mess of different colors, and it is very difficult to basically solve the puzzle and have then everything how it's supposed to look like, pretty neat. And this is exactly game design, because game design, the difficulty of game design is having these multitudes of elements and combining them into this experience. And the benchmark for good game design is having a person play a game that has never played a game before, or having a child play a game and deciding the child whether it's good. Because play and good gameplay is an intuitive aspect. It is very easy to find out whether the overall experience is cohesive or not. And there are multitudes of elements. Some call them game aesthetics, some call them game design elements. I'll just read them out since they're fairly messy here, but game design is also a fairly messy field. And game design elements can be constituted of anything from the geography of the game. So how is the space constituted? How does the movement work? Which mechanics do we have? How do the characters look like? What is the dimension of the game? 2D or 3D? How are the sound effects? The music? Anything from balance or the economy constitute game design, constitute a cohesive, integrated and unified experience. Because all of you who have ever played a video game can definitely remember a moment where you just forgot about anything else. And this is this moment where all of these systems and all of these elements of design interlock into a unified gameplay experience. And all of you probably can also recall a moment where you were disengaged. The moment something in the game didn't work, it didn't fit to the other elements, it was broken or something like that, you would immediately disengage from this experience. And the power of game design as an art form, as an artistic practice, is to enable this cohesive experience that allows people to step into different worlds and keep them in these worlds. And I brought you today as a case study a game that is a close contender to me as the best game of the year. I have worked on the game as a tester. It has been released, so I'm allowed to talk about that. And we at Linebridge, so where I work as a tester, we test multiple games. Sometimes we test multiple games in a week. and we see many, many games. But seldomly have I seen that everyone in the company was so excited to work on that game. There were people coming earlier to work to play longer and stay longer at work to finish the game, and which is a pretty good indicator for good game design. And with that, we'll have a first look at the launch trailer, which also contains gameplay elements. And then we will look at a couple of scenes and see how Dredge, a fishing adventure game, combines various design elements and constitutes a unified and cohesive aesthetic experience. So, can we play that?
Great can great is now.
First.
Brilliant.
All right, Dredge. So what you saw is basically, at its core, a fishing simulator. You play as a fisherman who comes into a new town, is hired as a fisherman, and you have actually no idea really what's going on. You just think that you're hired for a job. You go out, you fish, and slowly weird things are happening in the surroundings. This is a fishing simulator that is not just about fishing, but is heavily inspired by H.P. Lovecraftian aesthetics. So you go somewhere and things just become eerie and uncanny over time. But this is done in an extremely sophisticated manner, and I highly recommend also playing that game. I don't want to spoiler too much about it, but the question is here, what makes this a good game in regards to game design? So, as we spoke about game design is the art of interlocking different systems and design elements into this unified experience. And furthermore, it is also about taking an idea, an experience, and making it playable. Because in game design, game designers and game developers usually do not approach a game by just starting to develop anything, but at the forefront of game design lays the intended gameplay experience for the player. This is usually also how artists approach their works. Sometimes, of course, you have people who just paint anything that comes into their mind, but often many pieces of art are driven by theories and the idea of conveying a message to their viewers. In game design, obviously, the idea is to create an experience, try to find out what the experience is about. Is it about survival? Is it about adventure? Is it about exploration? And trying to realize that experience by assembling these game design elements that are necessary to sustain that experience. And in Dredge, we have a fishing simulator, which is pretty, well, a basic idea of a job simulator. But also the idea was to use this job fishing simulator as a basis to then create a mysterious experience, an experience that draws people in to explore the world of Dredge by taking their boat out for fishing, going and meeting different people and finding out how things are getting more weird and so on. If we look, for example, at a screenshot from here, this is most of the time in the game you will be encountering that. You have your boat and you flow over the ocean, you go fishing and you meet different people. But if we look closer, we can already see different game design elements that interlock here and they make sense in how they look like and how they feel. Unfortunately, we cannot play the game right now since this is just a lecture, but by looking at them, we can already have some aspects that interlock, like for example, the geography, which is not just the basically the rock that you can see here, but with geography and game design, we mean anything that can be traversed by the player, meaning also in that sense, the ocean. And here you can see wonderfully how the geography and the art style interlock. You have a low polygon style that meets basic impressionism and creates a very, very warm but blurry picture. In addition, the geography just blends in. Furthermore, we have aspects such as the perspective, because creating such an environment obviously requires you to make a decision from which perspective and angle the player is going to experience that. Are we going to experience this out of first perspective, third perspective, the eagle's eye, an isometric view? This can have all an impact on the player's perception and feel of the game. Here we have a third-person perspective, and it has mostly to do because in the game it was chosen that our avatar is a boat. And a boat is an inanimate object. It is not a human, it is not an animal, and it is very, very difficult to relate to a boat if you would be playing it from a first perspective. By looking at the boat, and later on you will be upgrading your boat with the new engines and different aspects, you start to emphasize with the boat. It becomes more or less the vehicle for your movement, for your quests, and so on. And in that regard, the perspective plays into the overall experience by providing an avatar that is difficult to associate with, but through the perspective, by seeing the boat all the time while we're playing, we're able to create a connection between that. The other aspect, and which was probably one of the most greatest things to play with, was the movement with the boat. So flowing, basically riding your boat in the ocean, you would encounter, of course, waves. Your speed would depend on which engine you have equipped and so on, but the movement would always feel very, very pleasant. So we have all of these aspects creating also like this experience. So you have a really, really pleasing art style. You have a geography that gives you the space, right, to move and traverse with your boat the environment. You have a perspective that allows you a very, very wide view on the things and enjoy this even as if it was just a very nice view on a sundown, and you can basically just move through it. But obviously this is not all that the game has to offer, since it brings in various different elements, and this is where it becomes more technical, because a game is obviously not just about creating an environment which you can move in, but a game always consists of certain rules that will challenge you in a certain way. And since it's a fishing game, two aspects come very in handy. Every time you go out onto the into the ocean to fish, you can fish by they basically created a way to fish that is also engaging by creating a mini game. Basically, every time you fish, you would basically have a mini game where you would have to press in time certain buttons in order. It would be a bit like an attention game where you have to press in time in order to draw your fish up from the ocean onto your boat. So they decided not to just like have an experience where you go out fishing and it is easy to catch the fish, but they made the fishing itself an integrated mini game in the game, a game in a game, so to speak. We have other elements such as, since anything that involves mechanics requires also always to convey a lot of information to the player, UIs, so user interfaces, are always a big part of a video game. And here we have, for example, that mini game, but also the aspect of our boat, so our inventory, some statistics about our cargo, our boat. However, this user interface is not just a block of text or a background, but even this, in the way the color palette was chosen, blends into the overall art style. So we have, again, a design element, which is the UI, but that is blended into the overall artistic style in order to decrease the friction between these design elements to support this unified gameplay experience. Here we have also a switch from the camera, right? You remember we had a third-person view from here. When we fish, this goes up so that we can see what we are actually fishing, what we are above. And it also, from a perspective point, blends in with the UI because the UI is two-dimensional. So the camera pans in a bird's eye view to support the two-dimensional perspective of the UI with the rest of the map, even though this is technically still three-dimensional. Another aspect we can see here is the balance of the game. A game is a system. There's a lot of code running. There's an economy running behind the game that manages how fast is your boat, how much damage does your boat is able to take, how much money do you get for a fish that you sell then in the harbor. All of these aspects run into an economy, and a game can only successfully convey this information with chunking the information. Not giving too much, but always just the necessary information to integrate it again into the experience, because if we would have then here a list with all of the other information that we don't need as a player in this moment, that would then draw us again out of this experience. Okay, did I forget here anything? No. All right, let us move on here. Another interesting aspect, which is probably one, has any one of you ever experienced being really addicted to a game? Like, not necessarily addicted, but you forget to go to work or to university, but a game that makes it almost impossible for you to stop? Yeah? This is what we call a game loop. A game loop is basically a set of situations in a game that are interlocked and they turn in a loop. I'll give you an example on basis of Dredge, because in Dredge we start always at a harbor, at our main harbor or different harbors, where we also rest, we sleep, we can buy items, we can sell our fish and so on, and we start our day always at 6 o'clock in the morning. Then we move out of the harbor, we go to fish, and as the day passes, night comes. The biggest enemy in this game is the night, because in night things become very weird, monsters appear and so on. So through this phenomenon that the night is dangerous, it closes a game loop, which means that every time we go to fish, we cannot stay infinitely on the ocean. We need to always then return back to our base. We need to sell our fish to also clear our inventory. We need to repair certain things, and like that we close a game loop, which is that we leave the harbor in the morning, we fish things, we find different characters that we can interact with, and as the day passes, we have to get back. And when we get back, we sell our fish, we clear everything for the next day, and the same process happens again. And if this is done well from a design perspective, meaning this is a flawless aspect, something that also, as we will see, the game Diablo probably done very well. It's basically you go out, you kill monsters, you get items, then you have a full inventory, you need to sell the items, you go back, and then you start anew. And this, closing this loop, having a game loop that is flawless, is what also unfortunately makes the game very addictive. However, in order to have that cohesive gameplay experience, a game must close such a loop. Otherwise, we are disengaged, because as players, if we see no end to the game, we have no minor loop that closes, we will disengage, and most often we will just get bored. And if you think about it, every successful game has in one way or another a game loop that closes. Even if you talk about Super Mario, you clear a stage, then you have that moment where you, the original Super Mario Brothers from 1985, even there you have a stage, a platformer stage, level that you clear, you then go into the castle, then you select your prize, and then you can basically start again. So even in the most simplest way, you will always have a game loop, also very successfully done here, and here governed even by time. So by a very natural day and night cycle. And time plays obviously also a huge role in game design, because usually games are not experienced in real time. In games such as GTA, but even here in Dredge, time passes way faster, of course, than real time. And time is, of course, also a dimension that needs to respect the rest of the design elements, because every experience needs to be tailored. If something is very dynamic, time passes quickly. If something is supposed to be paced, time will pass way slower in a game. The other aspect, of course, the environment. Right here we have our hometown. The design of an environment in a 3D world is something extremely complicated and difficult to do, to create a world that offers enough space for a player to be surprised, experience things, be challenged, while not having an open dead space in which players just turn but they don't find anything is also extremely difficult. And again, here we have something that interlocks, because the environment cannot be too vast, because we only have one day, basically the daytime, few hours to explore the environment before we need to return back, right? So these elements interlock into this one game loop. So the environment needs to be spatialized according to how much time we as a player have to explore before nightfall. Okay. Another element of the game, nowadays most games have clearly a lot of narrative elements. Dialogues, characters you talk with. It's not anymore Pac-Man where it's just about the mechanics, but it is also about engaging with other characters. And these are also part of the experience. However, characters need to be written well. In a game that is more or less serious and paced like Dredge, characters, they really shine through the way how they're written, how you engage with the characters. The overall tone needs to respect the atmosphere of the game. Again, we have like the art style. Even though the game is a 3D game, the character is represented by 2D, but the 2D style of the character blends into the overall impressionist and low polygon, low resolution style of the game. We have the UI again here, not too pokey for the player, with just a very simple black outline, and not much more to the UI here. But again, even these elements such as having characters, having dialogues, and choice need to blend into the overall game design. Yeah, and last thing, as I said, when nightfall comes, it becomes dangerous in the game. So during day, we experience a very smooth experience of going to fish and so on. But at night, fish become rather dreadful. And this is also a thing. How do we create an environment that on one side is very peaceful, enjoyable to traverse, where we fish, where we take our time? And how do we integrate suddenly a complete contrast, like a negative of it, by having suddenly a very hostile environment full of enemies? And here it's basically achieved by the fact that the enemies that appear in the game are basically the fish that you see already all throughout the day, but at night they kind of mutate. And this is part of the story, that you're encountering some weird mutations that are going on in the ocean, representative more or less of you could interpret it that, the aspect of toxic waste and the aspect of our impact on nature. Even in the game, you can overfish elements. So if you overfish, you have places where there will be no fish anymore in the ocean, and you can just decide to stop fishing at a place if you see that the resources are about to be depleted. In that sense, we have enemies that correspond to the rest of the characters in the game, or even the in-game objects, if you want to call the fish in that way, and it blends in. The other aspect is challenge. Dredge is a fairly accessible game, and it was thought as such, being a basic fishing adventure game. When picking up that game, most of the players are not seeking for an extreme challenge. So in that regards, even though the game is for sure not boring and will contain elements where you just die and you need to reset basically from your harbor, the challenge is not overwhelming. It is not unfair, and it is to a point fixed to the overall experience that it is not too disruptive. You as a player, you will not have the feeling that this is an unfair game and you're not treated well as a player. And all of these things, of course, unify its game design into gameplay, and gameplay is nothing else than your experience when interacting with a video game. Okay, so we talked about video games as art, right? Having this idea of a video game being able to hold the status of an artwork, of an art piece, something that you could potentially put into an exhibition and people would go there and think like, wow, this is art, because you can see it in a glass frame. We also then moved on to say that, okay, there are different perspectives. The aspect of interactivity remains important and crucial to look at, but how is this interactivity achieved? We established that interactivity, so which is essential to video games, is constituted by game design. Interactivity, or if you went so, good interactivity, proper interactivity for video games is achieved by proper and good game design. And why does this discussion even matter? I mean, like, why did you even come here, if it were not just for me, but for the topic? Like, why do you think that this discussion in the industry, at universities, at cultural institutions such as the Austrian Forum matter? That we assess video games through the lens of art or not art?
I guess maybe because we tend to undershade what the game is and how much effort goes into every single stage of creating it. People, because it's so fresh and so new, people tend to not even see from this perspective whatsoever.
So appreciation, obviously, this is reaching this point that we are at now, basically sitting here and talking about video games, having the possibility to write a BA diploma on video games is an achievement. It's an achievement which was a long uphill battle for many game developers, game designers, and also game enthusiasts to fight. So, and we all know, no one would ever say that art is bad, right? So if video games can claim this status, it makes them good, right? It's a very simple rationalization, but in the public, in the millions of people that are having this discussion, it's a very simple thing. Like, if video games are not art, it means they're not as important as other things. So obviously there's like the strong will to claim the status of art. Any other thoughts on that? Do you think maybe that the discussion doesn't matter at all?
Well, I think the reason why many people don't tend to recognize video games as art is because it's pretty new art medium, pretty new medium, I mean. And also people tend to forget that games by themselves existed long before we learned how to write, because game can be experienced not always through the computer devices, but also kids' playground or even the deck of cards. And for some reason, we don't make this connection from the games of the old times to the modern video games, and maybe that's why we didn't tend to recognize these old games as art then, because it was mere how to say it, mere device to have fun, to entertain yourself, and to pass time. And maybe that's the direction we should do to connect experience we used to have for centuries before with modern video games. Because as I said, for me, artistic value of video games lies in interaction, because that's how you experience it. That's kind of why a lot of people don't see the games are arts at all. Because the only way to experience game is to play it. You can't just show games on screen and not like this. You can just see game on screen and say you experience it, because that's how we may draw an analogy from the books. You need to read it to say you experience it.
And for me, to play it, you can just look at it or talk.
No, I absolutely agree. Obviously, there is a challenge to it. I, as an educator, experienced that on a weekly basis, that it's difficult to talk about video games in the classroom and then make people experience that, since it's also like a financial question over there, right? So for that, also the discussion matters, obviously, because I'm at the university and I'm asking, let's say, for my students, for my classes, to receive a PlayStation 5, most likely people in the administration would look at me like, what? For what? Like, do you want to play? And if you would say yes, they will not understand it because, so obviously, like, there's an importance to this discussion, because if they do not claim the status of art to a certain extent, it will be very difficult, as you said, in convincing people who can only look at games and think like, well, nah, it doesn't look as good as a movie, or it doesn't look as good as something else. So in that regards, it is truly an important discussion to still have. Though, something that I also would like to mention today is a discussion besides the cultural and educational sphere. It is namely for a discussion that also players should have. Because it was also said that, whether something is art or not is fairly subjective. I agree with that. However, if we say that it is just relative what art is, and it is relative which games art is, because what we will have no time to talk about today is namely that maybe there are games that are art, and maybe there are games that are no art, right? And the thing is that this discussion is something that we need to have, because some video games undermine even their own status as video games. Has anyone heard of the game Diablo Immortal? Yeah, Diablo Immortal is an hack and slay video game for your mobile phone, where it's a dungeon crawler, more or less. You go out and you defeat monsters, you get items, as I said, in the game loop. You return back, you sell your items, you continue, you go into dungeons, you defeat bosses, and so on. And this game used to contain no features such as intense monetization and microtransactions. Last year, Diablo Immortal appeared, and it is a game that, in order for you to fully play for a long time, you have to invest a lot of money. Because the way how you can get better items is by defeating stronger monsters. By not just that, but also by having a higher chance of receiving items out of a chest. And the great developers of Diablo Immortal, Activision Blizzard, thought it might be a cool idea to just let people pay money and then increase their chances of getting more rare items. Imagine you're going into a casino and you do not just pay money to play a slot machine, but you pay before that even more money to have a higher chance to get the jackpot. And this is how Diablo Immortal operates. And we'll be looking at a video where a streamer plays the same dungeon twice. Once with having invested into gems, so buying this in-game currency to higher your chances, and once without having that. So let us have a look at that.
Here is what this, man, this rep right here.
Can we be a bit louder?
A fully not reveal also knows that out there.
Can see the color of legendary items, this brownish bronze. And that costed him only $350. And that is without that modifier.
There's no chest. But he got an effort.
Okay, definitely the same situation in the game, the same player, but two completely different experiences. So what I mean when I say that this discussion on art is important, not just for people at the Cultural Forum or people at the university, but also people in the industry, is to understand that the status of art, if we can claim one for video games, needs to be also something that we protect. Because by defining certain boundaries and rules of what, let's say, the major community of games or players in general consider as something beautiful, as something worth playing, as something entertaining, as something worth enjoying. It is something that should be protected, because by allowing to have financial agendas and monetization that aim at the point of having companies basically creating games only for the sake of money, and don't get me wrong, making money with a game is a great thing, everyone needs to pay their rent, but having this intense monetization basically ruining that experience for players, because think about how many players will not be able to afford these chests because they don't have $350 that they can pay for a dungeon in order to get these items. You basically create almost a two-class society of players within one game. It becomes fairly political itself, but it basically challenges, it undermines the game itself as this cohesive and unified gameplay experience I was talking before. Because in a game, everyone should be, in a way, possible to experience an intended gameplay experience to a certain extent. I agree, gameplay is also fairly subjective, but most of the time, people will have an experience that they can talk together, they will have a shared experience. By, let's say, we reach the point where everyone considers video games as art, and we do not question this anymore. This is where something like this happens. The moment where we just accept that video games have claimed the status and they're protected, and we're entering this phase because, let's be honest, video games have already arrived in society as a legitimate activity, as a legitimate profession, and that is good. But we still need to be critical, and we need to protect ideas of what we call good design and bad design choices. Though, of course, this is a fluid discussion. Things will always change, and this will be always in discussion that will go on most likely for the rest of your lives, if you ever choose a life as a professional video game artist, designer, scholar, researcher, educator, programmer, whatever you like. Okay, so we'll be reaching the end of today's session. We'll then have also still time for questions and a discussion, but I'd just like to wrap up with you about the things that we talked about today. So, the status of video games in terms of art is a discussion. It is not something that I would like you to think as, yeah, video games are art and this is why they are art, or video games are no art and these are the reasons and that's it. No. If there is something that I would like to share with you here today through this session, it is that it will be always in discussion. Every time you will engage with a person on the discussion of the status, you should challenge yourself and you should challenge your counterpart so that we can drive this discussion for the sake of improving games and providing better experiences and ways of creating games in the future. We may choose to rely on our subjective impressions or engage in social discourse to determine their status. We have two options, basically. We can say that I don't mind because I enjoy games in that particular way and I don't care what anyone says. And that's okay. And this is what you can think, and this is how you can enjoy games. But you can also engage in a social discourse and discussion on that game. And this is something that I highly promote. This is something also called sociogenesis, reaching to consensus and knowledge by discussing together and having shared approaches to a topic. So either way, it is always good to exchange different perspectives on the topic. Now, we cannot speak about games without regarding their interactivity. This is, I hope, something that you understood. That is not much negotiable. Games are interactive. This is at the essence of video games, that you can interact with them. If you cannot interact with the game, then most likely it is not. Though, of course, if you want to challenge me on that, good luck, but I'd be up for that discussion. So, the art and practice of game design allows us to understand how aesthetic interactivity is created. So, if we determine interactivity as the essence of games, or to the essence of games, and that and there are, let's say, good ways of achieving interactivity and rather bad ways of doing so, then the only way of determining that is by understanding how game design operates, like interlocking these different elements. By understanding these different game design elements, by understanding how game design as an art functions, that allows us to analyze a game and understand why it feels bad. And because most of you, basically everyone, will be able to determine whether a game is good or not by just playing it. So, you will play a game and you will feel either frustrated or you will enjoy it. But understanding why that is, by understanding how all of these design elements come together in either a good or a bad way, will more or less empower you to understand these game design choices and either from a player perspective enjoy the game on an even more advanced level, or as a designer and creator to create better games. Because if you understand these components that do not fit together, or that there are some components that fit together, that will empower you to create better games by avoiding mistakes of creating design that is just based on your idea, but not based on how actual game design elements work together. And with that, thank you very much. These are my sources. Thanks for joining. And yeah, we'll have a round of questions if you want so. Thank you very much. All right. Yes, please.
I will say a little bit. And the critic name?
Yeah, Roger Ebert.
Yeah. And wasn't his opinion undermined because he admitted that he almost didn't play any game?
Yes, absolutely. And this is what he was then criticized for, because he evaluated games on the basis of their visual aesthetics and only that.
Okay, I have a couple more that are almost why this discussion about art or game or a video games mean art is still going. Almost every definition of art you would show us great was you can find a game that proves that game is art. For example, this Swarm Light is in the museum or New York, right? So you can fight for any definition of game that proves that their games are art. Why the discussion is still going, and with the Diablo Immortal example, do you think that there have to be like good or bad games and bad games to appreciate the good ones and to see art in them, and like roll with trash and the bad ones?
So I heard also about that exhibition. It's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it is currently exhibited, this War of Mine. And I totally agree on that you can take a theory and you can just select your game and, then prove that theory on a specific example. But of course, you cannot generalize based on out of that. The other question in regards to whether, so if I get it right, is that the question is whether we should, we should have like an idea of what a good game is and we should not allow bad games?
Do we need bad games to appreciate the good ones? If every game was like a masterpiece, I don't think we could see the art.
No, I absolutely agree, and I think that we're strongly dependent on bad games, and I love to also use bad games as an example in a classroom, because humans learn a lot through counterfactual learning, right? So we understand things better if we have a counterexample. Because if I tell you that this is art because of that, you will be like, okay, but you will not be able to contrast it. By providing you a counterexample, it will allow you to see the differences and maybe even challenge the notion. So no, I don't believe that we should go out there and we need to create, everything needs to be a masterpiece. We should burn all Candy Crushes and all our mobile games, and this is a current trend in game studies. It's what I call the neo-moralist approach. Basically going and trying to use games for social betterment and saying that bad games that only contain violence and so on, they should be not produced and so on. I don't agree with that. I think I'm an absolute libertarian if it comes to video games only. I think that there is a lot of things that should be tried out. However, we should have this discussion so that every person themselves can have that call and saying like, understanding that there is a qualitative difference between playing a game that you cannot properly play because you have no money and playing a game that offers that experience. So in that sense, I don't think that we should draw the line, not allow bad games to be shown and so on, but we should properly talk and have this discussion with everyone so that people can be critical about these games and make that decision for themselves.
Okay. Thanks.
Hey, you're welcome.
Yes, the question. There was mentioned the playground games. Do you think that it's still the same games that we are talking about? And is it an
What do you,
playground game?
I mean on the playground or?
Yeah, like kids playing.
Okay.
So
Okay. Yeah, I mean, like, the thing is that with, if you go somewhere, if you go on a playground, usually you will not encounter any games. You will encounter more or less an environment that is shaped, that allows for kids or anyone to play. Because most of the time you will have children inventing their own games by using the environment. So what these playgrounds are, they're not games, but they're providing tools and toys, more or less, by, having a slide or something like that, for children then to create their own games with their fantasy. Let's say they pretend to be a pilot, and then they drive down the slide or something like that. So in that sense, these playgrounds, they will remain until the rest of human history, I think, because they allow basically children just to create their own games and engage with environments in playful ways. So I don't know if that answers your question. Okay, great. Then I'm glad.
Please, looks like for us to have proper discussion, we need to talk about games in general, not only about video. And because when we talk all about video games, it is total perspective, and we tend to think that video games are art because we, for example, see something beautiful, beautiful imagery, beautiful hue, beautiful music, and something like that. And again, we don't analyze the interactivity, and we only analyze visuals and audio. Yes, we need to have a discussion about games that all wrong, as the click-run games, through the board games like this, or Dungeons and Dragons, to the video game.
No, I absolutely agree with that. Though, of course, it's sometimes difficult to talk about everything at once. So, in research, this is the idea of research is usually that we divide in smaller components and look at things in isolated manners, which is often also not that good. But this allows us to come up with some forms of conclusions. I agree that we should talk about everything. And I did my BA on ancient board games, so I have, I could do a whole session only on that. But I think it makes more sense if we want to talk more analytical about things by dividing them, because in order to talk about video games and games properly analytical in the same session, we would need to assume that video games are the direct successor of board games, which I don't believe, because it's not like board games are apes and then video games are the human that has emerged out of that. But board games are still going on, right? There are no new board games appearing, new card games. So they're their own form of play, so to speak.
Maybe let me paraphrase myself. Maybe we need to think not about if games at all but if gameplay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see. And in that regard, I would agree that this. I wrote a paper on the potential of games to hold aesthetic experience, because this presentation I presented is based on a work that I did, on a research that I did, in which I came actually to the conclusion that this whole discussion should not matter. The only thing that matters is that video games have the potential to convey aesthetic experiences. It doesn't matter if they're art or not, but what they can do is to invoke the feeling like if you were experiencing art. And this is the real potential of video games, and that you can construct them according to that. So yeah, I absolutely agree. But the problem that remains about talking about gameplay is that when we talk about it, it's already over, right? It's like we're talking about a firework that went off a minute ago. So yeah, we're at the end of the day grounded by language, about talking like here about it. But I hope that after this session, everyone will just go home and play their games and then think about these things. All right. Yes.
Well, maybe just not first. Thank you for the presentation. It was inspiring. It made me think about some things, and just wanted to share two of those things. One from the beginning, maybe as a critique. Just because something is innovative, it doesn't mean that it's art. A kitchen machine can be innovative, or a car, or whatever. But can talk about design and how much it is art because it's beautiful or functional or whatever. But maybe it's worth thinking about. Is something just new and that's art for like in a different way, or like what makes it art, which is also kind of goes back to your kind of definitions about what is art, like Fouchon's histoire and so on. And second thing that I've kept always thinking about is the contradiction, or maybe it's not a contradiction, would be entertainment art, because if something is fun or interesting, is it automatically art or not, or should it be like? It doesn't have to be like evocative. It could also be like having a deeper meaning, like make people think and so on, which may relate to one of your missions. So it's just like to share these more than that.
Yeah, and then and I definitely agree with the first statement that innovation does not directly hold then the status of art or good design. Like usually it needs a lot of time to actually then evaluate whether that innovation, was sustainable. And in that regard, is Facebook art because it changed the world? Is the iPhone art because it changed the world and was the latest innovation? It contains elements of design, it contains aesthetics, but does it make it art? But, of course, that is a discussion that we can have. The second point, which was about,
is it like entertainment?
Yes. Yes, this is a very, very good question. And I like to always answer this with a quote from Slavoj Žižek, my most famous philosopher, who has said that comedy is the reality of tragedy. And this is a very, very amazing quote because it answers this more or less, because we are, through our, basically our Western Christian upbringing, brought to the perception that we associate the sublime, the beautiful with something serious. It is just how we are brought up. These are like thousands of years of indoctrination to consider always something artistic or aesthetic with something painful, with something serious, with something sublime. And anything that goes slightly into the direction of fun and subversion and play is discredited as something that children do. And in that quote, that comedy is the reality of tragedy, is that if you look closely at fun and enjoyment and even at jokes, you will quickly realize that they contain as much essence to our perception of reality and history and anything that concerns society as approaching topics seriously. I myself, I make a lot of use of jokes and humor when teaching, because having fun while learning something or experiencing something is just way more effective than imposing something serious. It doesn't mean that, now everything should be fun. There's also like this, I hate gamification, this approach of that everything needs to be gamified and fun. I don't agree with that approach either, but fun and enjoyment and pleasure does not have to be the opposite of something sublime and serious. It's just part of an overall human condition and experience. So in that regards, I think we, from a cultural, historical standpoint, within the last 100 years, I think we have developed a lot into a positive direction to appreciate the more, funny and humorous sides of life and integrate them as something. But I still believe that at the back of our minds, many of us still often feel the guilt of this is too enjoyable to be actually real or true. This is just too much fun to be taken seriously. And I think that it will take generations to rework this if we're not falling back in reverse in the next decade. Hope that answered it. Great.
So to that the question, how do you feel about the journey?
Mm-hmm.
Because for me it wasn't like that much fun. It's more for like a reflection of all that. And for example, The Last of Us, where it can people in it because like the dog could like add this was like emotional and to like I don't know violent all that, but do you consider those piece of art?
So as I said, my definition of that is that I cannot tell whether they're art or not. No one can really tell because we have no access to answering this. But for sure, they can convey aesthetic experiences. I enjoyed Journey a lot, and like for me, it made me think because I think all of you have ever walked in a park, right? Can be also thoughtful. Journey is a bit like walking through a desert that is more like a park, basically. So it's a game that is not so much about dynamic mechanics, but more about traversing the space and like being attentive towards your environment, which is a sharp contrast to how we usually think about video games. With this way of mind, but also with Journey, we face the problem of social discourse. I didn't have the chance to play Journey without knowing already about its artistic status. So even before I played the game, on the cover were the prices that the game ran. I heard about, the game, and I had basically there was no chance for me to take a look at this game in an isolated manner. I played This War of Mine when it came out, so when no one really knew what it was about. So this was still an amazing experience for me. But are these, as I said, like, are these art pieces like...
I'm at The Last of Us.
Sorry. The Last of Us. Yeah, The Last of Us. Definitely, and like if I would have to make the choice and I would have to point the finger, I would rather say that Journey is a piece of art. If I had to make that decision, than The Last of Us. The Last of Us is way more focused on amazing level design and amazing mechanics. It does have this element of also a fantastic story and characters that are written, but then we come into what you already mentioned about the subjective experience. This is, how do we then evaluate while we're experiencing it, what that is. When I played Journey, I definitely had this thoughtful moment that I associate with an aesthetic experience, with an experience of art, while with The Last of Us, I had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun playing, and I must say that I didn't care that much about the story. I just enjoyed, traversing the field, defeating these zombies, and moving on, having this resource management it's a great survival, basically a horror game. So, yeah. I think we're more or less out of time, right? I mean, questions might be answered also once the camera's off, but I think that is then the time where it's right to actually call it. So I'd like to thank you all for joining in. Thanks for anyone who will be watching that. I hope you gained something on that. And again, games, whether video games are art or not, is a discussion that should and will never end. So always remain challenged, challenge your counterparts when having that discussion, and thank you very much.
And we also